Okay, we're in chapter 6 of Hilchos Teshuvah, and I want to start again because I think there's a lot to learn from here. I had some strenuous controversies years ago about some people about these things. We're talking about free will. We say that people have free will. God does not decree what a person shall do or become, and God doesn't put into the world features that force him in one path or another path. And we discussed at length the problem of God's foreknowledge. And now in chapter 6, he's raising the question that if you look at various verses in the Torah or in the prophets, it will appear that God takes away free will. Now, the truth is, the word appear is a little misleading, because in the end, he does forcibly stop people from doing teshuvah. He does take away their free will to do teshuvah. So the question is how that doesn't contradict his whole rationale that free will is necessary for us to fulfill what the Torah sets out. The Torah sets out a system of commands and prohibitions, and when people don't have free will, commands and prohibitions don't apply to them. When a person has no free will, then what happens is not something he's responsible for, so there can't be reward and punishment. If both the commands and prohibitions of the Torah and also reward and punishment are canceled out to such a person, what's the purpose of his existence? How does the Torah apply to him? Why isn't that a failure of the system if people don't have free will? As you'll see, the Rambam talks about this. When I read this many, many years ago, I created a whole elaborate explanation, of which I was very proud, and it took me about 10 years to figure out that it was completely unnecessary, and the answer is much simpler than I thought. So I didn't go back and check and cancel out all those recordings, but at least my mind isn't closed. Okay, so now this is what he says. There are many verses that seem, and he says seem, thank you very much for the water, to contradict this idea of free will. And people who read them will think that sometimes the Kodesh Baruch Hu makes a decree that people will do good or do evil, and that his actions are under his control. I'm going to explain to you what's going on. He says, first of all, you have to know that people or societies of people, when they commit transgressions with their own free will, then sometimes it's appropriate to punish them. And because Baruch Hu knows how to punish them, sometimes in this world, sometimes in the next world, and sometimes in both. And the punishment in the next world can include annihilation. And now he says, second point, when do I say punishment applies? Only if he doesn't do teshuvah. If he does teshuvah, punishment does not apply. Teshuvah is a barrier that prevents punishment. So we said yesterday, that doesn't mean there can't be suffering, because suffering can play the role of cleansing the person from the results of his crime. That's not punishment. Punishment is just because he did it, not because he's... In fact, this cleansing is a favor for him. It's a purification. It qualifies him to go to the world to come. So the Rambam is distinguishing between suffering, which is rehabilitation, versus suffering, which is a punishment. Now, he says, it's possible for a person to commit one gigantic transgression or many smaller transgressions to the point where din, justice, according to the true judge, is that he must be punished. he must be punished. For these sins that he did by his own free will. Now, we have now a potential contradiction. Because on the one hand, justice requires that he be punished. On the other hand, God has a commitment to Teshuvah that if someone does Teshuvah, he doesn't get punished. Period. So what happens if this person, whom justice requires that he be punished, does Teshuvah? Then he'll avoid that punishment. The solution to this contradiction is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu stops him from doing Teshuvah. Now, what I'm going to say now was implied from before, but I just want to make sure it's on the table. In logic, there's another way out. In logic, you could say, when someone commits such gigantic evil, make that an exception to the all-powerful effect of Teshuvah. Say, Teshuvah can be a guard against punishment for sins that have an intensity from 1 to 98 on a scale of 100, but for 99 and 100 it doesn't work. In logic, you could have said that. So you're not forced by logic to say he should take away his free will to do Teshuvah. But once you have on record that God wants Teshuvah to have no exceptions, he wants that to be all-powerful, then the only alternative is to make sure he doesn't do Teshuvah. So it's not as if God lacks the power to do it another way. It's his decision. He's decided that Teshuvah should have no exceptions. Okay. So now, and he says, that's the meaning of the verses that say that God takes away the power to do Teshuvah from Jews, like the verses in Isaiah, or from non-Jews, like Pharaoh, as it says in the book of Exodus. So this is something which applies to Jews as well. He puts Jews first. Okay, that's the structure of the argument. Now the question is, how does that solve the problem? The problem was, when a person has no free will, there's no purpose of the Torah for him. The commandments of the Torah have no significance for him because he's programmed to act one way no matter what. Reward and punishment can't be applied to him because you're not responsible for what you do when you don't have free will. So, yes, he's guilty, he's very bad, and he ought to be punished, and so forth and so on. Okay, I hear all of that. But how does it answer the question? Isn't this guy now in a condition where the Torah doesn't apply to him? And if so, isn't that a contradiction of the purpose of the Torah? So as I said, I worked out a very elaborate answer to this question, but I think the answer is very simple. God's commitment to free will for each person and every person is limited by one fact. One fact sets an absolute limit to each person's free will. That fact is death. You're not going to have it forever. You're going to have it for a finite time. And then you're going to be off page, off track, out of the picture. And by the way, you spend about 30% of your life sleeping, and that you're not exercising free will then either. God's commitment to the free will of a person is very limited. So no one has a complaint. He died? But if he died, what relevance do the commandments have for him? What relevance does reward and punishment have for him? He's dead. That's right, because the time's up. The relevance of the commands and the relevance of reward and punishment is for a limited amount of time. Now, you can have a person who, by virtue of his terrible crimes, becomes the walking dead. God says, you did all these things? You're finished, through, done, empty, die. No, don't die. I need you for something. I'm going to prop you up like a walking robot because I have something that I want to have done. But I don't owe you anything because for my purposes of the creation, you could die now. So nothing's lost. If he would die now, no one would complain that something was lost. So he's going to walk and talk for another year. But to say that it contradicts the purpose of the Torah to have a person with no free will, so that the commands and prohibitions and the reward and punishment don't apply to him is no different from saying that he's dead, in which case we take that for granted, that his period of acting and being responsible and qualifying for reward and punishment is a finite period. And usually it ends when a person stops moving, and for some people it ends when they keep moving. So there isn't a great problem here. There isn't a great, tremendous contradiction to the purpose of the Torah here. I think that's basically what the Rambam is saying. Are we together? Okay. Now, the second thing is this. Notice that one of the people to whom this applies is Pharaoh. So let's see what this implies. God wants to punish Pharaoh, and he takes away his free will because if he'll do teshuvah, he won't be punished. Now let's remember, Pharaoh's not Jewish. So what you get from this immediately is that non-Jews can do teshuvah. I had this out with somebody 40 years ago, and he didn't want to admit it. So I said, well, what about Nineveh? The city of Nineveh was an evil city, and God sent Jonah the prophet to prophesy to them they're going to go down the drain, and they did teshuvah, and they were reprieved. The decree against them was reprieved. So the guy thought about it, and he said, yeah, but that's only in this world. Only in this world. In the next world, they're going to get it. Teshuvah doesn't help for a non-Jew in the next world. Well, I said, go back and look at what the Rambam says here. The Rambam says, why does he give this introduction in the first two halachas? He says, people who commit transgressions, they have to be punished, and God knows how to punish them, some in this world, some in the next world, and some in both. Surely he means to be inclusive, otherwise why tell me this? So now, imagine that there's a sin which a person commits which should be punished in the next world, with this world or without this world. And the Rambam is going to tell me that if his sins are so terribly great, or so many, there may be the possibility that God will take away his free will so that he'll be able to punish him. Because if he has his free will, he'll do teshuvah and avoid punishment. Well, what happens if the sin that's being committed is one that carries punishment in the next world? So we're being told that if he does teshuvah, he will avoid punishment in the next world. And since it applies to Pharaoh just as much as it applies to Jews, it comes out that non-Jews can do teshuvah, and if they do teshuvah, they'll avoid punishment. Now, if you have a clever person who knows a little bit of the material, and he says, but Rabbi, there's only 7 mitzvos that apply to non-Jews, and teshuvah isn't one of them. Or there's 65 because the 7 are elaborated in 65, but teshuvah isn't one of them. So then I think we spoke about this at the very beginning of this series, that there are 2 aspects to teshuvah. One is that it's a procedure that accomplishes a certain goal. And the other is that it's a command for a person to do it, like putting on tefillin, or like giving charity, or pursuing justice. It's a command to do it. If you do it, you fulfill God's will, and you can earn reward thereby. And the fact that a person isn't commanded to do it doesn't mean that the procedure doesn't work. So, non-Jews are not they're not commanded to keep the laws of purity, Tumah and Tahara. If a non-Jew takes a tummy vessel and puts it into a mikveh, it takes it out, it'll be Torah. Well, it's just because putting it into a mikveh makes it Torah. That's the way it is. That's the procedure that does it. So the procedure of teshuvah, which repairs the failures of the past, the efficacy of that procedure does not depend upon your being required to do it. You're being commanded to do it. It doesn't depend upon that. So there's no hesitation to say that teshuvah applies to non-Jews. I think that's something important to keep in mind. Okay? Okay.
But do they get affected in the next world also?
Yes, non-Jews do have life in the world to come.
So that the teshuvah they do in this world cleanses them for the next world also.
That's right. That's right. Rambam says explicitly that there are 3 types of transgressions. One that's punished in this world, one that's punished in the next world, and one that's punished in both. And he says all of that is only when you don't do teshuvah. If you do teshuvah, you put up a tris, you put up a barrier against punishment. A person that does teshuvah can't have any punishment. That's quite striking. What I told you about the difference between punishment and suffering, that's my contribution. I don't see how else you could say it, because he says in chapter 1, and some transgressions need suffering for atonement. And here he says that if you do tshuva, let me say it again. He says in chapter 1 that some transgressions, even if you do tshuva, need in addition to tshuva suffering for atonement. And here he says that if you do tshuva, there'll be no punishment. So it has to be that the suffering in chapter 1 isn't punishment. It's atonement, which in Hebrew is kapara, which means cleansing, and that's not punishment. Punishment is something else. Yeah.
I was wondering if teshuvah for even things that like have the punishment of karet, can it stop the karet?
Teshuvah for something that has the punishment of kares, which is being cut off from God, yes, it can stop the kares. Teshuvah works for idol worship. Teshuvah works for murder. Teshuvah works for everything. For every possible transgression, no matter how serious, teshuvah works.
Illicit relationships also?
I'm sorry?
Illicit relationships also, right?
Relations?
Illicit sexual relations.
Sexual relations?
Illicit.
Illicit sexual, I mean, they're not as bad as murder, right?
No.
Okay. And it works for murder. Sure. Of course, it works for everything. Teshuvah is all purpose. Okay. So now the Rambam asks a question. Really, this is parshanut. This is just explaining the episode in the books of Exodus. If God took away his free will, Pharaoh's free will, why does he keep sending him messengers, or I should say agents, to tell him, release my people and do tshuva? Especially since God told Pharaoh that he's not going to be able to do it. There's a verse that says, you and your servants, I know that you're not ready to accept the responsibility to let them go. And I've set you up, propped you up, only to demonstrate something to future generations. So, what is it that God has accomplished by propping him up after while he's taking away his free will? He says, in order to inform the people of the world, boy olam, not Jews, everybody in the world, that when a person prevents someone from doing tshuva, a transgressor, then he's stuck. He will not be able to do tshuva, but he will die in his wickedness, his evil that he did originally with his own free will. And he brings other cases where it speaks about God hardening someone's heart, like the king Sichon, and the Jewish people at the times of Eliyahu, who did terrible crimes and numerous crimes. And the pasuk there says, "V'yato hasibosa es libo machronis." The prophet says to God, "You turned their hearts backwards," and it's true. He did. He turned their hearts backwards so they wouldn't be able to do tshuva. You prevented them from doing tshuva. So the general rule that you get from this is that God didn't decree that Pharaoh should do evil to the Jewish people, at least at the beginning. That he did with his own free will. It means that whatever happens to a person in life is dependent upon his free will as a result of his free will. But one of the results of what you do can be the loss of free will. Now, if that sounds mysterious, let me remind you of things that you know very well. I even used this a couple of times as an example. Let's take an example of someone who goes drinking. In Israel, I don't know if they still have it, but it used to be an advertisement on the radio. When you go drinking, give your keys to your friends. That's what friends are for. You go to get drunk, make sure you give your car keys to your friends so that you don't go driving drunk. It's a very bitter advertisement, in a Jewish country for Jewish kids, but okay. Now, when he started to drink and he has his keys in his pocket, he had free will. He was able. Then he drinks, gets in the car, blind drunk, can't see the road, drives and has a crash, right? He can't protect himself by saying, I didn't decide to have a crash. It wasn't my free will decision to have a crash. That won't protect him because he committed free will decisions that deprived him of his free will later. And you are responsible not only for your actions, you're responsible for the consequences of your actions. And sometimes your actions result in your losing your free will down the line. So in exactly the same way in our practical lives, we can perform actions that will deprive us of free will. God says, sometimes I take that role also with respect to a person. A person freely chooses to do an enormous amount of evil, gets to the point where justice required that he be punished. I have a rule of my own that Teshuvah stops all punishment, so I stop him from doing Teshuvah. It means his free will decisions to commit all those crimes result in his losing his free will. And this is also comparable to what I said 10 minutes ago. When a person dies, he loses his free will, and it can be that his crimes get put into the point where God says, no more, I gave you enough chances, you don't deserve any more chances. All of this, I think, is perfectly natural, normal, and acceptable without any fancy footwork. Yeah.
If I'm following correctly here, but at least when a person dies, it's not like they can do anything anyway. In the case of someone who doesn't have free will but they're still alive, what would that mean? How would they act?
So they would be programmed, at least in the area. Now, you see, I didn't make this point before, but given the story of Pharaoh, all God wants is that Pharaoh shouldn't do Teshuvah. That doesn't require him to become a total robot. If he wants to play soccer, maybe that's okay. If he wants to raise taxes, maybe that's okay. Just when Moses comes to him and says, let my people go, then the screw has to turn. No, I'm not. No, I'm not. No, I'm not. And then when he leaves, he can go back to making his free decisions. That's all you need. But the meaning of it is just like, take the parallel I just gave you. What does it mean that God keeps him alive, drunk, driving the car when he doesn't have free will? Why should he be alive? The answer is that if your own free will decisions cost you your free will, then what happens after that is a result of your free will. You're responsible for it because of your previous free will decisions, so it becomes part of your history. So that's not zero. That's not zero. So he keeps him alive because living out the consequences of his bad free will decisions is part of what has to happen to him.
How do you know we're not like Pharaoh and that we're programmed not to do Teshuvah?
So let me turn it around and point out that if Maimonides hadn't told you that this exists, you would never have dreamt of it. So there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever in all of your experience that you don't have free will. Now, to flip your intuitions and say, well, now I've been told that sometimes free will is taken away. Maybe no one has free will ever all the time. That's going much, much too far. The information we're getting now is that it happens in very specific cases. It happens in cases where a person's free will decisions have created such a surplus of evil that strict judgment requires them to be punished, and free will shouldn't be taken away. Right? I think almost all concepts have black, white, and gray areas. There are lots of black and white in this case. Right? There are lots and lots of cases that are white. It's clear that when the people in this room have not committed the kind of evil that Pharaoh committed, or the evil of Jews who killed prophets and or who devoted themselves to idol worship. We're not talking about that kind of case. So the only case where you would have a realistic, what we call havamina, a realistic hypothesis, would be a case which would be intuitively comparable to Pharaoh or comparable to the Jews in those terrible generations, and we don't have cases like that. Yeah.
What about issues of mental health, where someone's mental health makes them struggle to do teshuvah on a specific issue, or on maybe they can do teshuvah in general, but on a specific issue it makes them struggle to do teshuvah. If they felt the full regret of something they did, they would.
If they felt, I didn't get the word.
They felt the regret of something
Yes.
they did, it would harm them in some way, or they're what if that is an issue?
So you're raising a sort of a package of interesting questions. Take for the very last thing that you said. If his regret would harm him, yeah. So then, does that mean he can't do it? The Gemara has a case of someone who repeatedly committed certain crimes, and then he came to realize it was wrong, and he put his head between his knees and cried until he died. His regret cost him his life. That was a great victory. A baskol, a voice from heaven, proclaimed, welcome, and they called him Rebbe, Allah's Manadaria, welcome to the world to come. So if that's what you mean by damage, congratulations for the damage. That's good. So I don't think we have to worry about risking that. But you do have a question about mental health where some people are just not competent either to appreciate that they've committed a crime or they're competent to run their own affairs. This has to be handled with great delicacy. For example, I'm not a psychologist, I just read. I'm told that a psychopath doesn't register pain in other people, or at least some of them don't register pain in other people. A psychopath can say this: I have this knife, I want to put it down in a safe place. Now I got two choices. I can put it into the table, or I can put it into George's arm. Experience has taught me that when you put it into the arm, there's a lot of yelling, and there's blood all over the place. Yeah, that's unpleasant, But on the other hand, if I put it into the table, it's going to make a nick in the table, and that's not nice either. So I'm weighing up the alternatives, table or arm. Which one should I do? She said, but if you put it in his arm, he's going to be in terrible pain. And he says, what's that? When somebody hits your arm, you're in pain? Yes. So when somebody hits his arm, he's in pain? What's that? I don't know what you mean. His arm is in pain? To him, it's like saying that the table will be in pain. It's just pain doesn't exist there. It's not located there. Right? So this person has no free will in this area because he doesn't know what he's doing. He does not know what he's doing. You can't hold the person responsible for doing something when he doesn't know what he's doing. That's a terrible psychological disability. On the other hand, when a person says, I just can't help doing X, and therefore I'm not responsible, often that statement is very tricky. Let's take, again, I'm speaking from what I've read. I'm not an expert in this area. I'm using it as an illustration. Take kleptomania, where people steal things. Right? And say, I can't help it. I go into the store, and when nobody's looking, I put them in my pocket. I just can't stop myself. Well, I have a suggestion for such a person. Hire somebody to accompany you in the store and watch your hands. As far as I'm informed, when somebody's watching him, he doesn't do it. So hire somebody to watch your hands, and you see it watching your hands, and then you won't do it. That's not where his free will is lost. His free will is lost when he's standing in front of the wallet counter. There's nobody around, and I can put a wallet in my pocket. But if somebody's standing there, it won't happen. So is he totally out of control? Well, he could take a precaution to make sure that the conditions which put him out of control won't happen. So to say that he's totally out of control is a tricky proposition. And I'm sure that psychologists could give you 25 different subtle issues in this matter. So I think it's not something to be just taken for granted. But there is the possibility. The example that I used a few days ago was, you imagine a gang, a drug dealing gang, that takes a 6-year-old and injects him with crack. I don't know how many times it takes, but they inject him enough times, against his will obviously, to addict him to crack. He will steal. He's got to have crack. He has to have it. He's desperate for it. I think it's reasonable to say under those conditions he doesn't have free will.
Even when he gets older.
So, again, I'm just reading the literature, what it's like, and it does sound to me like it's an unbelievable desperation. This is not like, for example, alcoholism. I was talking about alcoholism, and an alcoholic came up to me afterwards. He said, I'm sorry, let me inform you, you don't understand how alcoholism works. He says, I'm a recovered alcoholic. And he said, I could go to a party when I was suffering from alcoholism. I could go to a party, I could drink socially, and I could, I could go home socially. But when I went home, I drank a bottle. So temporary reprieve, temporary, and in front of other people, he could control. So now, what would happen if the people followed him home? So I don't know. But I'm just saying these issues are subtle issues. One can't simply say, well, if you have an addiction, you're out of control, therefore you're not responsible, and go ahead for the. It's much more subtle than that. Yeah.
So if you have an individual that you cannot make responsible for his actions, how are you supposed to deal with the consequences of what this person is doing? Like, what are you supposed to do with this person?
Okay, so now let's go back to what I said, this is a couple of weeks ago, that even though you have free will does not mean that you have the power to become perfect like that. We said free will means you have the power to start a process of development that will lead over time to doing the right thing. This is clear in the Rambam because he says your free will because you have free will, you can incline yourself to the good path to become righteous. So your question could be asked about what happens in the meantime when it's still doing the bad things. The answer is, when you're doing everything that you can do, you're not held liable for the bad things that you're doing. You're only held liable for the things that you have power over. Now, for the aficionados who know a little philosophy, you'll notice that I used the word liable. I didn't use the word responsible. And if you've read Kant and you've learned that ought implies can, Judaism rejects Kant. Judaism principle is ought implies that there's no liability for failure. But it doesn't require that you have the capacity to succeed. So that's a whole issue, and I have a separate share on that, and maybe we'll talk about it someday. But the truth is, if you have no ability to do better, then you're not liable to any negative consequences for not doing better. So we have that built in. All progress, most progress is gradual. And while you're making gradual progress, you're still doing wrong things. And that's so that you're not liable for any penalty when you're doing the best that you can. Okay? We're together? All right. So I have to stop in 5 minutes because there's some, you're going to Shlomo Schiller's and you're going to have a barbecue or something. Okay. So he says, this is something which you find great people who pray, they pray not to have this happen to them. Lead me on a path of truth. Enable me to sanctify your name. Leave my spirit able to act freely, to serve you, and of course that includes doing teshuvah when necessary. And even more than that, it's not just don't take away my free will, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu promised us that He will help us. There's a very interesting phrase in the Gemara which indicates that you make your decisions and the consequences are dependent upon your decisions, but the phrase is not symmetrical. Habo l'taher misayin loso. A person wants to come to purify himself, God helps him. Plural, from heaven, heavenly forces help him. Abodatame, poskim lo. A person who wants to degenerate, wants to pollute himself, they open up for him. They don't help him, they open up. So he has the power to do it, but so to speak, if you want to pull yourself down, you do it all by yourself. God's not going to help pull you down in general terms. But if you want to pick yourself up, you want to improve, then you will get help. So everything depends upon your free will, and God is not abandoning you to the mechanical environment, but the way in which He interacts with you has a prejudice built in, that is, He's prejudiced on the side of the positive versus the negative. and therefore, in one case, he'll help you. In the other case, he'll just allow you to operate. You know, he may give you enough rope to hang yourself with, but he won't tie the knot. Right? He won't help you do it. Now, there are people whose records are so bad that they don't deserve to live in the world to come. We said that in the classification of different transgressions. And for them, something different happens. If their evil is such that they have no place in the world to come, what happens to their good deeds? Of which there may be some anyway. So God is fair, God is just. He has to pay them for their good deeds. So he pays them in this world. And that's the reason why sometimes you see colossally wicked people who have some good conditions in this world. And you think, where is God's justice? And the answer is, well, maybe it's not while you're looking. And maybe it's not in this world of observation. There are lots of other environments in which existence is precious and valuable and hoped for and has unlimited reward, and the person can lose that without you ever knowing it. So to judge that as an injustice is usually premature, just on the basis of what you see of a person's lifetime. Yes?
So I learned that Pharaoh later did Teshuvah, and we went to, or made Nineveh, I believe.
Maybe what?
He was a
Nineveh,
king of,
Nineveh, king of Nineveh, and he made Teshuvah, right?
Yeah,
But also learned that in some of the lower levels of Gehenna, he's at the gate.
Oh, so I have to quit now.
Oh,
The midrashim are not consistent.
Okay.
Midrashim represent different points of view. Number one, and number two, I told you, and I didn't solve it this time. The verses here that talk about hardening God's heart, which Maimonides tells us means God took away his free will. There's another view that these verses don't say that at all. The very verses of hardening his heart say that God preserves free will and restores free will. The Rambam says that. So, and I asked you to think about how that could be. How could the words mean that God restores free will instead of taking it away? And those midrashim could be going with that pshat in the verses, where God didn't take away his free will. So Maimonides is going with this pshat in the verses. I will pick that up again on Sunday in Yisrael.
Shkoyach.
But yeah, have a wonderful Shabbos.